The US and Fiji have signed a new defense pact with the US, offering almost $5 million to help support the modernization of Fiji's military. The deal comes during a time of rising tensions in the Pacific. Foreign Affairs reporter Dziedzic says the new deal gives the US military a larger presence in the region.
So there were a couple of elements which are worth pointing to. The first is that the US is going to hand over about $5 million to modernise Fiji's military. Now that is dependent on congressional approval. That'll probably come, and given that, it's a welcome contribution to Fiji beginning to build up some of its expertise in that space. The other things that were agreed to are perhaps more interesting. The first thing they did was they agreed to a logistics arrangement. Now, this logistics arrangement will essentially make it easier for the US to move things like fuel and people throughout Fiji in the case of a national emergency. The most interesting thing of all, however, is probably the thing that they've only begun negotiations on, which hasn't yet been signed, which is a status of forces agreement. Now, a status of forces agreement is in many ways kind of unremarkable. The US has signed dozens of them with countries across the world. It essentially sets the rules and the systems for US personnel to rotate through the country. So what it does is essentially lays a framework for those sort of rotations. What does it mean? Well, it means that more and more US defence personnel, Coast Guard personnel and others are going to rotate through the country. So even though the agreement itself is kind of unremarkable, what it symbols strategically, or what it means strategically, is that there are going to be far more US military assets, far more US military personnel rotating through Fiji. So this is a real statement of intent from the US. Yes, they're helping Fiji in some of its key priorities, including in disaster relief and trying to monitor some of its vast economic zone, but we are also going to see a greater US military presence in Fiji. Not a military base, that's been explicitly ruled out by both the US and by Fiji, but we're going to see a larger presence of rotational forces moving through Fiji as a matter of course, and that has got consequences.
So, Stephen, what does this agreement and this historic visit by the US Defense Secretary tell us about the battle for influence that's clearly playing out in the Pacific between Washington and Beijing?
Yeah, there are two things that are happening. The first is that in the outer realms of the Pacific, from a US perspective, we're starting to see the US step up. So in countries like Fiji or in PNG, where the US signed a defence cooperation agreement last week, we're starting to see the US put in building blocks to allow it to essentially give itself options both in peacetime and in wartime. So with the agreement that's been signed in PNG and the agreement that's now being negotiated in Fiji, we're starting to see the US beginning to put in place the sort of infrastructure that's necessary for the US to be able to move its assets through the Pacific more easily, as well as just building up closer defence-to-defence ties with countries in the Pacific. So we're going to see essentially the US trying to build its military influence in countries like Fiji and PNG. What we're also seeing, though, Girish, at the same time is the US moving far more urgently and with far more speed in the North Pacific, in the Micronesian nations, as well as in US territories near Guam, in the so-called Second Island chain, where the US is really keeping one eye fixed firmly on China and one eye firmly fixed on the possibility of a proper war in the region or a regional conflagration, which might happen in the instance, for example, that China launched an invasion of Taiwan. So in countries like the Federated States of Micronesia, in countries like Palau, as well as in US territories like Guam and the Northern Marianas, we are seeing the US build up a massive military infrastructure. In the Northern Marianas, they're clearing a runway that was used back in World War II for US assets. In Palau, we're also seeing runways being cleared and redeveloped for use by military aircraft. We're seeing in other parts of Palau, modern radar systems being installed. All of this is basically the United States preparing to give itself options if there is a regional war or a conflagration. Now, it's worth remembering, the US has a number of bases in the so-called first island chain in places like the Philippines and in Japan. But if there is a war with China, these are likely to come under bombardment very, very quickly. That means the second island chain, Guam, and the islands around it are going to assume an enormous strategic importance very, very quickly. And that's why the US is not just building up its capabilities in places like Guam, it's also building up alternative spaces in places like the Marianas, like FSM, like Palau, where it can move assets, where it can move troops very quickly. So if Guam is hit by a series of missiles in a conflict situation, it can then move those assets and troops very, very quickly. This is happening at breakneck speed, Girish. This is something that's got enormous strategic consequences for not just the US, but also for the Pacific. And it probably hasn't received enough attention in regional fora or elsewhere. But the reality is the US is preparing for the worst case scenario. And if war does break out, this will have enormous consequences, not just for the Northern Pacific, but for the Pacific more broadly.
And Stephen, given the pace of change you've been talking about, as well as the upgrades to US assets in the Pacific, can we expect things to change, though, when the Trump administration takes over?
It's a really good question, and it's a really difficult one to answer. Perhaps because we simply don't know at this stage exactly what posture the Trump administration is likely to take. On the one hand, we know that Trump and his close advisors are much more sceptical of the military alliances which have buttressed US power, not just in Southeast Asia, but also in the North Pacific. And they're much more sceptical about the US handing over resources or money in order to preserve those alliances. So countries like the Philippines and Japan are likely to be watching the Trump administration quite warily, worried that Trump will take a more transactional approach, worried that he will demand much more, for example, money from countries like Japan, South Korea or the Philippines to justify the military presence that the US maintains there. On the other hand, the Trump administration is going to be quite hawkish on China. Trump has appointed a number of very prominent China hawks, including Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, to key positions in his administration. And they've made it very clear that competition with China and the US strategic posture in the North Pacific is going to be a key priority. So you'd imagine that Trump is unlikely to press pause or stop on some of the initiatives that we've seen in the North Pacific under the Biden administration. This is a complicated way of saying, Girish, that there's just enormous uncertainty about exactly what Trump means for some of these geopolitical currents running through the Pacific. We're not sure to what extent Trump's transactionalism might curb US ambitions in the region. We're not sure to what extent the hawkishness of some of his key advisors might actually see the US expand some of its efforts throughout the North Pacific. We're simply going to have to wait and see.
OK, Stephen Dziedzic in Canberra, thanks very much once again for your analysis.
Thanks, Girish. Appreciate it.